Chapter 13. The Old Loam. "Are you sure about this?" Kendra scrubbed her eyes against the morning's sleep. "I didn't think anything scared you, Caleb," she replied, a hand half hiding her ragged smile. The response was expected, immediate, and somehow heartening, as the elf visibly bristled. "I'm not scared, damn you," he spat. "How can you be making jokes at a time like this?" "If I can't change anything about the situation, being grumpy won't help me much either. Caleb, no matter what direction we go in, it certainly seems like we might find something awful sitting in our path. If it's east, it's a labyrinth of jagged rocks and a whole lot of notes about cave trolls. If it's west, it seems like the very ground is reinforced against the sheer toxicity of the area so it wouldn't leach into the water supply. So, we go south. Straight south, the most direct route. The best way forward is through the Black House." She ran through the argument patiently, again. It was part of his process, as near as she could tell. There was a certain amount of complaining, fussing, and extensive re-examination characteristic of Caleb before he was willing to accept an idea as appropriate and necessary. "Just you wait," he muttered darkly. "After you meet a dwarf, you'll wish you'd have chosen the poison." It had been nearly a week since they'd left the living city. Her dreams had been troubled for days, full of blood and the cold stench of terror, and always that terrible grin. She'd woken up drenched in sweat many times, shaking with an inescapable sense of pursuit, of being hunted. But slowly, those dreams faded. The days went by nearly as dreamlike as the nights. For a time they had walked among dense meadows of yellow flowers big as houses, some living, some vine-wrapped stone, blocking out the sun as surely as any tree. The next day brought a series of delicate bridges amid a buzzing, cloying fen where dark shapes swam just beneath the surface. That was followed by a thicket of naked trees, leafless, oozing sap and catching at their hair with clawed and hostile branches. Slowly the fear eased, in no small part thanks to the fact that these new trials were anticipated, chosen. For in that one sense, she was in her element. Kendra had been reading. The book was an obtuse and unconcerned guide. Its discourse meandered around technical issues of stonework, weight distribution, aesthetics, very occasional fragments of maps, and even more occasional allusions to the would-be occupants. She had spent each evening poring over their contents with Caleb, but much to her mostly discreet delight, the tome defeated him. At first she struggled as well with its undulating focus, exacting and utterly detailed in places, then vaguely dismissing entire topics. But slowly she began to puzzle together the thoughts of the writer. After one of Kendra's ever so slightly smug epiphanies, Caleb finally left her to it. "In all my years of research," he'd fumed, "I've never read something so bloody impenetrable. Take it, then. You're likely the only person alive with as ass-backwards crooked a mind as this damn author." So Kendra threw herself into the reading, interpreting and puzzling, and for her waking hours she escaped thoughts of that hair and of Adrian. They broke camp and made their way with ease through uncharacteristically thin and meek undergrowth. This posed no mystery to her. She knew that this area would be in the shadow nearly half the day, even though she could not yet see the great structure that would cast it. Then, with almost startling abruptness for such a behemoth, the trees parted and she saw it. It was a great dome of absurd proportions. Its height was lost in the flare of the late morning sun, gleaming sharply down off the smooth, dark stone. From where they stood beneath it, The object appeared almost to be a sheer wall. It was only by looking far to either side that they began to see the curvature. Its surface seemed perfectly smooth, but for a sharp triangular cut at the base, not far off, that allowed for passage within. "Well," said Caleb glumly, "are you ready to bid the sun farewell?" Kendra laughed in exasperation. "It's not more than a few miles across," she replied lightly. "With luck, we'll be out before sundown." He grunted. "Sundown, maybe. But then, maybe not this sundown." "Has anyone ever told you you can be a bit of a pessimist, Caleb?" "Call it a survival trait. I know trouble when I see it, and a labyrinthine dwarf hole, that most certainly qualifies. This place had a reputation even before they started squatting here." He patted him on the shoulder gingerly. He bristled, but only just. "It'll be all right," she said soothingly. "Now, come on. You won't feel any better just standing outside." The starch slowly left him, and finally, with a mulish snort, he started moving. The glare off the dome cast all the depths beyond the opening into total darkness. Kendra's stomach fluttered with trepidation, but also undeniable anticipation. The illustrations of the place seemed staggering, almost beyond belief. With just the barest moment's pause, she turned back. The foliage swayed tremulously, fragile, children of the sunlight tossed gently on the approaching storm front. It was still following, steadily, tenaciously, and for a moment she felt small in the crucible of two waves of shadow crashing together. Then she stepped forward and let the black house swallow her. Those first steps were an unmitigated assault on the senses. The plunge into darkness was abrupt and absolute, and the sound deadened in the same instant. Sounds of life, trickling of water, the wind, all died away against thick walls of stone. It was in that state of deprivation that Kendra first tasted the air of the black house. It was overwhelming, an odor of decay and must, carried on drafts far warmer than she had expected of such colossal stonework. It was some small comfort to her that life did indeed exist here, just as anywhere else in the garden. Only virulent life could give rise to such a stench of death. Eyes watering, they pressed on. The ground had a give and softness to it, out of sorts with the precise architecture above. Even as she adjusted to the darkness, she could not make out the ground they walked on. Indeed, she only narrowly avoided walking into the looming walls of the long, straight corridor. But she was certain of one thing. The crux of the ceiling was beginning to arch up and away. "I thought," Caleb began, his terse tone not quite covering his anxiety, "you said that there would be a source of light." But his voice petered out as a faint glow edged into view. Stepping out from the tunnel, an expansive landscape was laid out before them. Faint blues and magentas, just enough to see by, were cast luminously from every direction off of sprawling clusters of infinitely varied mushrooms. They went on, sinking into the murky distance. Far above on the dome, the fungi hung down from distant perches, scattered like stars upon the stony black firmament. And at the center of it all, miles away, and peering through a pinhole in the apex of the dome, a lone beam of sunlight cast down through the faintly swirling dust and spore, a pillar to hold up the sky. "Beautiful," Kendra breathed, and reluctantly Caleb nodded. Passing through the gloom, Kendra was put in mind of going down the row of a forgotten orchard. There were signs of old care and guardianship, paths once straight and clear, the huge mushrooms roughly grouped in types. Now all was dense and overgrown, mixing and blurring, caps sagging in over their heads. It was thick enough to blot out that far-away column of sunlight at times, try as they might to keep it in view and ahead of them. Here and there, amidst the rows of fungi, a great specimen would loom up out from the throng. At first she thought them sick, riddled with strange holes up through the stalk, almost perfectly round. Then she gasped. "Caleb," she said in hushed tones, "look, those big ones. I think they're buildings." He squinted, then shrugged with a sniff. Leave it to a dwarf to live inside a bottom feeder. He placed a hand on her shoulder as she began to make her way towards the nearest one. "It'd be best if we attracted as little attention from the locals as possible." She colored slightly. Her curiosity had gotten the better of her for a moment. Right. The lanes ran straight enough, easy to traverse, until finally they turned round a bend and found the way blocked. A great mushroom, lumpy and misshapen, tall as a wagon, seemed to have collapsed across the path. Caleb clicked his tongue disapprovingly. "The scale of this place might be impressive, but it's a proper pigsty." Kendra only shrugged and began to clamber over it. It was surprisingly silky to the touch, and with a spongy consistency. Almost immediately she found herself slipping back down. With a grunt, she tried to hop up to a handhold. Perhaps there was some spring in the material beneath her feet, because she wildly overshot, launching herself far atop the mass with a pillowy thud. She yelped, then giggled. "Caleb, you've got to try." Beneath her, the mushroom began to move. Kendra cried out, trying flailingly to right herself, but she could find no purchase in the downy mass. In short order, she was being lifted, caught in the crook of some malformed limb, so thick and nebulous as to barely warrant the term. Slowly, the behemoth turned to her. It did have a face of sorts, though it was hidden under shags of overflowing chitin. There was a flat, shapeless gash of a mouth, and from the depths of two holes bored deep into its gray flesh there was 2 pinpricks of green light. Kendra sat paralyzed, but after several moments she realized that nothing was happening. Suspended and entangled, she stared up at it, and it stared right back, expression fathomless. There was no sound but for a faint shredding below. Kendra looked down and saw Caleb tearing into what she now recognized as a leg. She hissed at him and winced slightly as he looked up. His eyes burned a terrible crimson, desperate and angry. But she swallowed and gestured for him to hold, mouthing, "Wait." She turned back to the hulking mushroom creature and gave an uncertain smile. "Hello. I'm sorry I climbed on you. I didn't realize you were, Her mind searched for a word, and then a memory clicked into place from an afternoon in the library back home. "A mycelite," she said with a small flicker of delight. It had not been immediately apparent. There was precious little written about the creatures, if indeed creature was their proper classification, and this one looked very different from the illustration. Bulkier, shaggier. At the very least, she seemed to recall that they were scavengers, not predators. She fervently hoped so. The mycelite stood silent for a while. Then a strange rumbling came from its throat, almost musical in character. She furrowed her brow, and only several moments later puzzled out a word. "Shear?" she asked, perplexed. The creature ponderously raised its other arm, and she gasped. The blades of something like a pair of heavy garden clippers were lodged in its arm. It was deep in the tissue, surrounded by many slash marks through the shaggy exterior, now matted from some congealed stain, dried and yellowish. "Do you want me to take it out?" she asked. Another pause. Then it purposefully inclined the heavy cap of its head. She nodded cautiously. "I can't move. Can you slide me over to it?" With surprising gentleness, the Mycelite leaned her out of the crook of one arm onto the other. It was still an unstable surface, soft and with many layers slipping beneath her feet, but she was no longer wedged between two intractable surfaces, and she quickly made her way over to the wound. Gingerly, she tried to pull out the shears. They did not move. A bit more force, some wiggling, it made little difference. Finally, she gave up on delicacy. Firmly planting her feet against the forearm, she heaved her whole body, and the blades pulled loose with a nasty metallic schlick. She cried out in shock, apologizing profusely. The wound was now oozing a thick, clear liquid, but the hulking creature showed no sign of discomfort. It leaned its head down to her, and for a moment she flinched, but it slowed as it approached. Fibrous, fungal nets hung all around her, smelling heavily of earth and must. Again, it let out the same strange rumble. Shears. And a suspicion began to form. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted the shears and began to clip away at the thick outer layers of loose chitin. "Kendra," called Caleb pensively below, "what the hell are you doing up there?" "It asked for shears," she replied, oddly calm. Strings and sheets began to fall all around her as she worked carefully, but with growing confidence. The Mycelite seemed to hum, and she got the impression that it was pleased. "It asked," came the flabbergasted voice below her. "It's a mushroom monster, Kendra. It can't talk." She snorted. "Maybe you just weren't listening very carefully," she said cheerfully. She heard a growl below her and smiled. "We can't stay here," she called up impatiently. "We don't have time for you to sit around messing with a Mycelite." Kendra ignored him. "I think normally it has its coat trimmed, like a sheep. And if it doesn't, it gets too bulky to move around. I think it tripped over itself, and that's where we found it." "An interesting theory," Caleb replied, and the comment sounded genuine in spite of the obvious tension. "But it's none of our business if the dwarves are poor shepherds. We have to keep on the move. We don't want the dwarves to find us here, trespassing and messing about with their livestock." "Listen, Caleb," she said placatingly. "I just want to give this big fella a bit of help. He seems like he's suffering. As soon as I'm done, we'll get going. It won't take long." But it was a much longer process than she could have anticipated. The sheets of chitin had to be shaved off one at a time, or else they were too slippery and unwieldy to get the shears around. The tool itself was not very sharp, clearly the worse for wear after its time stuck in the crook of the Mycelite's arm. And the creature was massive. It was nearly an hour before she was done, but the results were stunning to behold. It now much more closely matched the creature out of the illustration, standing nearly 3 men tall, almost sleek. Her workmanship was inexpert, uneven ridges still hanging here and there, but the effect was impressive nonetheless. The blood-red gills beneath the cap of its head now fluttered vigorously. "You couldn't breathe, could you?" she murmured, brows knitting together. The Mycelite inclined its head down to her once more, and just brushed against her scarred cheek. It rumbled again with its deep-throated voice, and after a moment's interpretation, Kendra nodded. "You're welcome, friend," she said warmly. "Are we done here?" asked Caleb pointedly. She rubbed her neck with chagrin. "Looks like it. Sorry." Kendra turned back to the great creature to say farewell, and blinked in alarm. The Mycelite had tossed back its head, cap nearly perpendicular to the ground. Its mouth, which had barely opened in all the time she'd seen it, now hung wide, pointed to the high ceiling. With a low and resonant bellow, it called out. The earth trembled, and Kendra and Caleb both put their hands over their ears in shock. It was only when it had passed that Kendra could consider the words. "Keepers are back?" she asked, nonplussed. Then, all around them, sounds of rustling and dragging, some distant, some nearer, began to approach. "Keepers?" hissed Caleb in alarm. "What are you talking about?" "I don't know," said Kendra, a little panicked. "It said it, not me." "It said?" Caleb ground his teeth. "It doesn't matter. We need to go, quickly. This has to have attracted attention." Reluctantly, Kendra nodded. "You're right. We've stayed too long." They turned to leave when a moan came, quieter now, mournful. Kendra turned back. "I'm sorry," she said, pained. We have to go." The mice light rumbled back, and after a moment she blinked back tears. "I think," she said throatily, "those are its friends coming. I think they're all like this one." Caleb frowned, but it was almost sympathetic. "You can't save them all," he said simply. "They need help," she said, her voice small and pitiful in her ears. "We could... Kendra, we just don't have the time. Not if we're going to avoid any unfriendly ears that heard your big friend. Not if you want to meet up with your caravan in time. Not if we're going to stay ahead of that thing that's following you." She turned back to the creature, strangely forlorn for its monstrous size. How many of your friends are there?" she asked desperately. It stared at her, then slowly rolled its head, gesturing broadly about them. Her heart sank. "Too many," said Caleb solemnly. She stood rooted to the spot, stomach churning. Then she nodded. Caleb began to walk away, and with the barest pause, Kendra began to follow. "Goodbye," she whispered, glancing back to the mice light. It loomed over the lanes, watching them as they began to pick up their pace to a near run, until at last it too fell away into the haze. The rustling continued as they went on. Caleb began to duck between lanes, pushing through thick rows of mushrooms, tall, overgrown, hanging so far overhead that at times they blotted out any trace of the distant beacon of sunlight. As they went, a stench rose up, a miasma of rot and decay that overpowered the smells of the living fungus. Even the mushrooms themselves seemed more unwholesome as they went, slick and viscous to the touch, as if in the throes of fever sweats. There were noises close now on their left, and Caleb pushed her firmly through the slimy fungus to their right. They crashed through the row of mushrooms, then stumbled. A white boulder lay immediately on the other side, knee-high, sending them crashing into the mud. It was a foul substance, dark, sticky, and stinking of death. Caleb spat and thrashed in anger by her side while she lay winded. "You all right?" she mumbled as he kneeled over her, and after a moment he snorted and nodded. She groaned. "All right, let's keep going." She began to haul herself out of the muck and back to her feet, futilely wiping it out of her face with equally filthy hands, when she stumbled. Something ice-cold and hard was grasping her ankle. At first she felt only shock. She simply did not know what she was looking at. The white boulder had unfurled, and she had the detached thought that there was a trace of something humanoid in its shape. It was half-coated in the sludge, and some of its features were murky and shrouded in shadow, so it was hard to tell if perhaps there had once been a fourth limb. It was raising itself up, twisting to a low, tripodal stance. What was not covered in filth had the characteristic of white marble, once clear and defined, now scuffed and abandoned. But it was the face that caught at Kendra's eyes like hooks, leaving her staring in wordless horror. A cavernous hole opened up roughly in the center of its head, a crumbling crater that sank down into a sort of throat. Then its hand began to tighten around her ankle, and it growled, agonized and hateful. The bubbling cauldron of its maw began to boil over, a choking fountain of that black liquid splattering over her, and Kendra screamed. With all her might, she stamped down on the thing's wrist. Her foot went numb at the collision as the grasping limb gave way, breaking like rotted stone run through with infesting grubs and stagnant dead roots. The thing hardly seemed to notice. It began to rise shakily, propping itself up on the shattered stump of an arm until it stood on its own 2 feet, stiff and purposeful. Then it began to fall forward, catching itself in a shambling but relentless stride. Caleb kicked down at its knee from the side, sending it staggering back into the mud with a sickening crack and splash. He all but lifted Kendra off the ground, pulling her roughly on her feet. "Run!" he cried, grabbing her hand. The gurgling howl of the thing grew louder, and as they fled, answering screams began to rise out of the surrounding lanes. The shuffling abominations were not quick, but they were far, far too many. The ground they ran on sucked at their feet, the nauseating muck seeming more and more a hindrance as they went. Kendra was limping, her foot still numb, and sending up sharp shoots of pain now with each step, and even Caleb was beginning to look fatigued. He had ferociously attacked one that had blocked their way, but it was like breaking down a stone wall, and the monster seemed scarcely aware of its injuries. Before he could inflict any meaningful harm, more were upon them. He was changing directions frantically, his grip hard and painful, his eyes flashing dangerously. But there was no denying it. They were being hemmed in, run down. "Caleb," she panted, "we can't keep running." He ignored her. "We have to hide," she continued urgently. He stopped abruptly, and she might have crashed right into him had he not seized her by the shoulders. Claws pressed against her, and her face fell to behold him. His fangs were gnashing, breath falling hot over her, his eyes a transported crimson. "Of course you want to hide," he seethed. "Sniveling, cowering, just waiting to die. You... He stopped, some inkling of recognition coming into his eyes. With terrible effort he let go of her, panting from more than mere exertion. "Where?" he asked, with a hollow harshness. "The houses," she stammered, pointing, not quite able to take her eyes off Caleb. The building wasn't far, one of the tall mushrooms, riddled with holes, looming above the fields. Gurgling and howling rose ominously between them and their destination, but those sounds seemed to press in from every direction now. Caleb considered it, then nodded sharply. Any attempts at stealth were abandoned as they ran full out towards the structure, crashing and breaking through chitinous barriers, slipping through mud, pushing past staggering horrors that clawed at them with dead, insensate fingers. Her lungs burned, but it was looming close now, and she almost dared to believe they'd make it. Caleb was just a step ahead of her, clearing the way with violent shoves and swipes, when he was thrown to the ground with a meaty thud. One of the faceless monstrosities had been hidden in a thick clump of foliage, and now stood blocking the way. Kendra cried out and skidded messily to Caleb's side, a wave of filth cascading beneath her. He was dazed, red eyes vacant, and as she looked up, she saw more stepping up to encircle them. With a tight grip on his collar, she hefted him onto her back and made to leap past the nearest of the monsters, hopelessly, throat tensed to feel that icy grip throw her down. She was soaring over its head, its pawing hands just passing under her feet. Uncomprehending shock rang in her mind, and she nearly fell disastrously in her landing. It sent a painful jolt up through her ankle, but she was still standing, and was running again in an instant. She had passed under the shadow of the great mushroom cap. She could see it now, see a small door, mercifully ajar, near the base of the immense stalk. With a clumsy, crashing tumble, she fell through the opening, Caleb spilling off her back. In a graceless panic, Kendra threw herself against the door, slamming it closed and slapping shut the latch just as the first impact came from beyond. The door, some shiny, dry material, seemed to be made of sterner stuff than she had given it credit for. It flexed slightly, but was holding for now, even as the howling crashes grew louder just on the other side. Frantically, Kendra surveyed her surroundings. It was not so strange a room, a humble little workshop. It had been torn apart a long time ago, smears of inky blackness across the floors and walls, broken furniture of the same odd, shiny material as the door scattered about. Caleb lay moaning against a lopsided table, split in half. "What in the hell?" he muttered vaguely. There was blood trickling off his brow and into his eyes. The nearest of the tiny round windows, covered only by a brittle, semi-translucent membrane, shattered as a stony hand pushed through it. Kendra cried out, ducking low over Caleb as sharp fragments cascaded over them. With rough, pawing movements, the hand was beginning to widen the hole, heedless of the jagged edges cutting at it, relentlessly pulling away chunks of the porous wall. They were breaking through. She had led them into a trap. Kendra looked down, crestfallen, a dry sob in her throat. There was something on the floor in the corner of the room. Half covered by the rubble of the broken dwelling, there was a ring, smeared with more of the same black slime. Kendra squinted, then scrambled to it, urgently pushing bits of furniture and debris out of the way. Her eyes lit up, desperate and fearful, but not done just yet. It was the handle to a cellar door. With a great heave, she pulled it open, swinging it up, a cloud of black dust rising as it came dislodged. It was partly jammed, the hinges bent and worn, but there was enough space to wriggle through. "Come on," she said urgently to Caleb, tugging him towards the gap. Through his haze of pain, he still managed to look down disdainfully. "You take me to the nicest places," he said. Then, with a grimace, he slipped under the door. Kendra followed close behind him. With a last frightened look back, she watched as more arms pushed through windows, tearing at the walls, the room transformed into a nightmarishly churning gullet. She slammed the cellar door shut over her head, and darkness fell.